forms of ownership and okay, recording in progress. Platform socialism, you haven't missed much. I just thanked my wife. Platform socialism examines different forms of ownership and governance for digital platforms, so we can start talking more about what might replace Facebook rather than just fixing it. And I think this book is really important to come out at this moment, because I think we're now at a crossroads, looking at a very radically different paths for how the internet and digital services more generally could develop. I think it's the end of an era for a certain generation of companies that really did amass unprecedented wealth and power over the past 10 or 15 years. So companies like Amazon, Google, and Facebook, these are now daily fixtures of our lives. They now provide the digital infrastructure for how so much of our lives actually function. You know, they control what we see, how we communicate with others, and they influence what we buy. So like many scholars and critics have already shown, there are so many shocking consequences for the rise of these tech giants, right? So new forms of exploitation, a real degradation of working conditions, and all these things that are happening at the heart of platform capitalism. But more recently, I think we've seen the start of a new set of articulations for what might come next. And so terms like the metaverse, Web3, crypto networks, DAOs, all these kinds of terms are now starting to dominate discussions on Twitter and in the public realm about how the digital economy should be organized. Now, some of these are just basically like recycled pictures of old ideas and old products. So you can see that like metaverse is like a second life. NFTs are JPEGs, but with more clout. And crypto is basically just like an online casino. But having said that, many of the largest companies are starting to rethink their business models. And they're also being challenged by a host of new competitors that are very eager to push this narrative that there is this fundamental break and a fundamental change taking place. So I think there are things up for grabs. And this book was written from the optimistic standpoint that it is still possible to imagine and build a better version of how platforms could work, the very platforms that are now dominating our lives. So now any realistic assessment of our situation couldn't help but acknowledge that, you know, the odds are really stacked up against us. But despite all this, I think it's important to be hopeful and to keep energy and enthusiasm alive for supporting alternatives and for thinking about other ways of doing things. And for one, I'm really heartened by the number of people that have gotten in touch since I first announced writing this book, who are experimenting with new systems and new product designs and new kinds of software. And I really think it's important to keep working with those and supporting them and developing them. And so I wrote this book to offer a really small contribution towards thinking about what kinds of alternatives already exist, what prototypes we have, what new ones might look like, and how we could go about building them. And really, for me, I wanted to offer the perspective of someone who was outside of the tech world, right? Someone who is outside looking in, someone who starts from the political problems rather than treating these issues as like design challenges or technical problems. Someone who kind of focuses on the politics first and foremost and sees these as having political problems at their heart. And so when I started thinking about this book in 2019, I noticed that most of the critical perspectives that were getting airtime in mainstream media were predominantly from those who were like tech insider turned critics, people like Tristan Harris, more recently Frances Haugen. And what I think that, you know, entailed was that we were only really hearing from people whose entire worldview and ideology had been shaped by the industry. And so I wanted to offer a perspective that was different from these, someone who wasn't looking to stay friendly with all of the elite tech circles or work for the Biden administration or start up a new humane tech NGO. Because I think when we only listen to the voices of those who've already taken the Google money and the Microsoft money, I think it means we're often limiting ourselves to the types of solutions that are on offer. And I don't think it's surprising that many of the reform proposals don't fundamentally break with many of the practices and business models of these companies. And so there was another reason I wrote the book as well. I think I also wrote the book because I was thinking how I could repackage some of my own ideas that weren't selling very well at the time, for those who haven't completely sold out already and become clout sharks chasing your next podcast. I say to you, why not put the term digital or platform in front of whatever it is you're researching beforehand and see what happens? Because the last time I wrote a book, it was on the German workers' movement, very trendy topic, as you know, early 20th century. So great time. It was the 100th anniversary, nonetheless. And I spent 5 years writing this book, and I looked at it recently on Google Scholar, and it had two citations. And one of them was from a guy whose PhD I examined. I feel like that doesn't really count, because if you're examining someone's PhD, then, you know, they're kind of obliged to put at least one reference to you. And it's also not a publication. So I don't know, is Google Scholar picking up everything these days? I don't know. So it's one citation. So I thought I needed to do some rebranding. I don't think it helped that Oxford was like selling it for like £55 for a Kindle edition. So you would pay £50 and you'd get like a PDF. That was obviously not helping, but obviously, you know, there were probably other problems there as well. So I thought slightly different strategy, put the word platform in front of socialism, and then suddenly much more interest. So that has been good. And it works for me because I still get to write a chapter or two on the ye old folk from the early 20th century. So I'm still getting my rocks off. I'm still having fun. And so, you know, it seems to be a bit of a win-win in this case. But the original title for the book was actually going to be Monetizing Community, because the way I came about, you know, thinking about these issues was thinking about the history of tech companies and how they started to employ the language of community empowerment and fulfilling a social mission to cover over some of their more extractive business practices. And so then this kind of got reduced to one chapter within the book, and I started to build all these more positive proposals on at the end, you know, thinking about how we could improve things, how things could get better. And I started to realize that this was basically the best part of the book. You know, it was what was the most novel. We have many critiques of tech companies, but we don't have as many explorations of alternatives. And so I thought my real contribution was trying to bring a knowledge of the history of the workers' movement, history of socialism, into some of these contemporary debates on tech. And so one of the things I hope you take away from the book is why our current response to big tech needs to go beyond the kind of antitrust and anti-monopoly agenda that currently dominates the debate on the center and center left. Because I don't think that the problem with these companies should be framed exclusively in terms of how they stifle competition in the tech sector. And in both Europe and the US, criticism of tech companies really gravitates towards anti-competitive practices. Like on the right, you have this idea of like, you know, a liberal domination of social media. But I think in the center and on the left, it's really about big conglomerates breaking up big tech, you know, curtailing their anti-competitive practices. And I think the assumption here is that beneath some form of bad and twisted monopoly capitalism or surveillance capitalism, there's a more ethical and healthy capitalism to which we could return. And I don't think this is the case. I think this misunderstands the structural incentives of these companies and the kind of political economy of data markets and the markets within which they operate. I think even if these companies were separated into smaller ones, many of them would still be encouraged to operate in a very similar manner, right? So harvesting data, downplaying concerns, maximizing user engagement, and putting profits above most other concerns. And because advertising platforms like Facebook and Google are built on the business model of extracting user data and selling the consumer insights to advertisers. So I think restoring competition, it might be one important short-term goal, but it shouldn't be the only thing that we're talking about. We also need to talk about non-market, public, commons-based forms of funding and developing alternatives. So I think the problem really is not that the CEOs are unethical, but that they're for-profit businesses and they're incentivized to use their infrastructure to maximize engagement and to behave in the ways that they do. So what then could be an alternative to this, right? If it shouldn't just be about restoring competition to the tech sector. So one of the contributions of the book is developing this theoretical kind of widespread wholesale alternative. And when I say platform socialism, what I'm talking about is a system of social ownership of digital infrastructure and democratic forms of control over the digital services that have become so important to our everyday lives. So what I'm really focusing on in the book is, rather than just regulating tech companies, how can we foster alternatives, ones that enable a much more active participation of users, ones that enable them to have a stake in their design, in their governance. And one of the contributions is to show how we can draw resources from a much older tradition and alternative, one that I kind of construct as a pluralist socialist tradition, because I think some of these writers offer a fresh perspective on how we could democratize the digital economy. And so what do I mean by socialist pluralism? Well, one of the figures I draw on is the guild socialist, G.D.H. Cole, who was kind of writing in the late 19th, early 20th century, and who was a critic of the Fabian Society and some of the Fabians at the time. And a second figure that I draw upon is Austrian economist and philosopher Otto Neurath. And I think with this more heterodox kind of reading of some of the key socialists of the early 20th century, some of whom participated in the socialization debates and the socialist calculation debate, we can start to talk more about different ways we could democratize the platform economy. So if you are looking for alternatives to private ownership, you're often faced with this dichotomy and this like alternative between state-led nationalization, where ownership is passed directly to a government or a government department. And on the other hand, more direct forms of workers' control, where workers kind of directly take over their company. And what's interesting about these pluralist socialists is that they offer us a way out of this dichotomy and show that there are problems with a strict adherence to each approach, and that there's actually a better alternative altogether. So the problem with the first option, this kind of state-led nationalization, is that it often leads to a very top-down managerial form of the organization of these businesses. It's one that's really dominated the 20th century. And it doesn't guarantee greater worker participation or forms of workplace democracy, doesn't necessarily get you any closer to forms of local decision-making or devolution of power, or these kinds of things that you might want from a project of democratization. So there is a risk of replacing private capitalist owners with distant bureaucrats. Now, the second option also has its own problems, right? If you have what was prominent in many forms of syndicalism, which is a kind of workers directly taking over their places of work and owning and governing them. Well, one problem is that there are inequalities that would instantly emerge between different industries and workplaces, right? So some people are going to be taking over Google while others are taking over a local bike courier, and that's obviously going to pose problems. The second issue, and perhaps an even bigger one, is that further inequalities would emerge between those engaged in full-time paid work and others who did voluntary, unpaid, or care work. And I think there is a danger always in attaching too many political rights to specific economic institutions, because it doesn't have that more universal aspect that comes with, universal suffrage or voting. And whenever you talk about workplace democracy, it has to be nestled within greater coordinating institutions. So what could the pluralist socialist tradition offer then? Now, I think the way to escape these kind of two alternatives is to start talking more about a diverse ecosystem of different forms of social ownership, ones that can exist alongside one another. It doesn't have to be a kind of one size fits all. You can have a kind of radical pragmatism that adapts different institutions to different needs and different communities. And so the guild socialism of someone like G.D.H. Cole really helps us to think about the different functional roles performed by digital platforms. So we can look to what the platform does essentially, who it serves, what kind of communities exist on it, and how could it best achieve these goals. And so we're really thinking about a question of scale and different levels of democratic ownership, maybe different publics that are larger or smaller depending on the platform. And one of the ideas I float in the book is this idea of a principle of subsidiarity. So perhaps services should be delivered at the most local and proximate level that would enable them to be undertaken in an efficient and sustainable way, right? So in the book, I propose a range of ideas for how different kinds of platforms might function, how a kind of ride-hail platform might function, how a new public search engine might operate. And these kinds of publics range from local workers' cooperatives, because I think cooperatives would have an important role to play in this, right up to much more international level solutions, international foundations. I even suggest something kind of similar to the ILO, but a kind of digital services unit. And so really this is thinking about the question of scale and the question of pluralism, of different kinds of ownership structures. And this is one of the big proposals of the book. Now, a second really core thesis of the book is thinking not just at this meso level of organizational structures or institutions, but what's the big picture? Because I say that, platform socialism is a wholesale alternative. You can't have platform socialism without full-blown socialism. And so I have a small little section about quietly socializing capital funds. But if you draw out the implications for that, yes, it is a kind of wide-scale change in the ownership of investment. Now, I draw on Otto Neurath to think about how we can start tackling these big system-level challenges that we face, things like climate change, responses to global pandemics. Because one of the contributions Neurath makes is he talks about how the private ownership of capital, of production goods, if you will, needed to change from a form of private ownership to one of social ownership, where democratic collectives decided on long-term goals for how to allocate resources, right? This shouldn't be in the hands of a few private individuals to decide when and where we're going to space and on whose terms. His point was that you needed to establish democratic forms of control over these big picture industrial policy, investment strategies, and then we needed to have rational deliberation on this. And so he's in favor of a form of democratic planning and economic planning that's not simply about optimizing for efficiency in production, but it's about thinking about different kinds of futures, different kinds of lives that we could live. What will our society look like? How will it run? What are the kind of guiding principles? Do we want to invest more in one type of energy or another? And so what Neurath really makes clear is that you need to make these qualitative decisions about the form of life that you want to live, the kind of societies you want to live in. And so Neurath imagines an economic plan as a kind of blueprint for the future, a particular vision of a way of living. And that this is something that must be democratic, right? That we need democratic processes and public debates to decide how we take these major investment decisions. And so that's a very interesting part of the book. I was very thankful to the, Socialist Calculation Debate Reading Group there. We first discussed these kinds of ideas. And it's another big part of what's going on in the book. But the point I wanted to kind of leave it on, just to give you a few little tasters of what is happening in the book, is this idea of utopia, right? Because I think more than anything else, platform socialism seeks to reclaim this utopian imagination for the left. And I don't think it's enough to just offer critiques of what's bad in society. And I don't think our books should finish with like one short chapter about possible ways forward. I think we need to say something positive about what realistic alternatives we could develop and pathways to get there. Because I think the left, particularly in the tech sphere, hasn't been very good at doing that so far. I think if you look around at all the new ideas that people are discussing for the future of the internet, things I've already talked about, the metaverse, NFTs, whatever, these are mainly ideas to hang new products on. It's really hard to imagine what a kind of non-marketized version of many of these would look like, or how we could have a kind of social economy online that didn't just instantly become tokenized and kind of reduced to a kind of barter economy. And it's sad that the innovative visions of the future are mainly coming from companies and kind of weird thought leaders who are essentially just looking to big up their own companies. So I think it's really important that we talk more about the left creating this transformative vision, because I think many of the most interesting and successful transformative projects that the left has done when it has come to power have been on the back of a radical reimagining of society, of really bold proposals, of new visions that seek to create this new common sense for how we should organize society. And I really enjoy being a part of Autonomy, the think tank that's hosting this, because I think that's precisely what we're engaged in. And so I think that's a struggle worth fighting, and yeah, a very important part of the book. So thank you for listening to me prattle on about the book. Now, I asked Rahel and Roberta if they, could prepare a response, because both of these two people have been, really important and instrumental for me developing some of these ideas. And we have a reading group that we discuss these things in. So I'm very excited to have both of them here today. It means a lot to me. Did we talk about who would go first? Roberta, do you want to go first and then Rahel?
I can totally go first.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. And I'm very honored and excited to be here. Yeah, so in the following 5 minutes, I would like to focus on an aspect that I found particularly interesting about James's book and worth discussing. So as someone who researches big tech and is interested in new data governance models and alternatives to the status quo, your book made me realize that even though most of us want to think outside the box, many of our most prominent ideas are perhaps less radical and innovative than we'd like to think. For example, by advocating for proposals such as breaking up big tech, regulation corporations via antitrust action, or advocating for individual property rights in personal data, we essentially draw on recipes from the same cookbook, so to speak. So in other words, most of these solutions continue to be informed by a set of values that we know all too well: competition, efficiency, deriving surplus. What I really appreciate about your book, on the other hand, is that you invite us to rethink our digital existence in a much more comprehensive and fundamental way. We are not just encouraged to think about ways to improve or tinker with the status quo, but to think about what a digital future with an entirely new set of values could look like. A future that emphasizes collaboration over competition, shared benefits over exploitation, and community over isolation. Your emphasis on community and public welfare is both refreshing and urgent, especially at a time where public administrations and policymakers around the world start looking at platform companies for solutions to their institutional challenges and talk about Uberizing the state. Your book provides an urgent reminder that we should be approaching the matter from the other direction. And by that, I don't mean to say that we should let an ecosystem marked by big tech collapse into one of the big state, but to put people center stage and think about how we can arrange our digital ecosystem in a way that emphasizes true and local self-determination. As you show in the book, there are various ways to approach the subject matter. This could happen, for example, via worker-like cooperatives that enable people to directly interact with prospective customers instead of depending on extractive intermediaries for work. And of course, there is Barcelona's Project Decode, a smart city pilot project that used citizen data to improve traffic flows and reduce noise pollution. And it did so in a way that was both privacy preserving and emancipatory. Readers will find several exciting proposals and historical best practices in your book. So I don't want to give away too much, but rather encourage viewers to check it out themselves. What I would be interested to hear, however, would be how you would go about bringing platform socialism alive today. So let me close with the following question. Let's assume we had a British policymaker in the audience who had essentially a carte blanche and could transform any area of your liking. For the sake of simplicity, let's take Great Britain. So where would you suggest she started and how would you go about it? Okay, thanks very much.
Sorry, James, try and unmute yourself now.
Thanks. Sorry, I wasn't able to unmute myself. Thanks so much, Roberta. Before I answer your question, can I just do another quick plug that, can you post that in?
I'll do that. I'll post the link to the book and also a discount code for everyone as well.
Muldoon 30. So yeah, thanks very much, Roberta. I don't know. So I don't know what I would say to like a carte blanche, because I just feel like there are so many important projects that I don't really want to pick one because everyone will just say, well, that's not important. So let me just tell you one idea from the book rather than the most important essential thing that could be done. I was speaking about platforms operating at different scales, right? And one of the suggestions I mentioned in the book is for a municipally owned ride-hail platform. So think Uber, but run by a city, so City of London, for example. Because I think the infrastructure that you need to run such a service is too expensive and too difficult to operate for like a small workers cooperative to be able to do it. There have been some attempts, and I think there are some interesting experiments. But I think this is an example where a municipally owned service could be really useful. So in the book, I talk about the example, a hypothetical example of Ride London, which would be an on-demand service that could be administered by Transport for London. I think it's really interesting how this would work because you could integrate it into the existing public transport infrastructure and take advantage of all the existing data and knowledge about mobility that Transport for London possesses. You could then design the software around how cars are picking people up that put workers' needs at the center, that aren't about just gaming the system and making everything as exploitative as possible, but giving drivers a fair wage and also nudging customers towards more environmentally friendly options, because the entrance of Uber and a lot of these ride-hail platforms into the market has been incredibly destructive. It's really increased pollution in a lot of the big cities, and it's not sustainable. So I think finding ways to basically offer this service for people when they need it in emergencies, for those who don't have other options, but also finding ways to kind of push people towards public transport is really important. Now, I know this wouldn't be as effective in small and mid-sized cities, but I think something like this in some of the largest metropolises would really could be an effective way of designing this. I know Transport for London have thought about this on occasion. I have talked to people who have kind of like made inquiries about how much it would cost, but I think it's basically a matter of political will more than anything else. And I think it's just more favorable for Sadiq Khan to basically, try and cancel Uber's license and have this big posturing against it, but perhaps not fronting up the money that would be needed to actually have an alternative. And obviously there's the black cab market, which is very influential in London. So yeah, that would be my quick answer. But there are loads of kind of possibilities that I put forth in the book. And I should say, I don't expect any of these to be like the final word on anything, right? I'm not like, this is the only possible solution, get out of town with your solutions. It's more like an invitation for us to start talking more about alternatives. I think that's really important. But thank you for your question, Roberta. Rahel, did you want to give your contribution?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. So, thanks so much, James, and also Roberta. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Yeah, I think maybe just I start with saying that I'm really, really happy and yeah, it makes me really happy to see that your book, James, is already provoking so many interesting conversations. And so maybe just adding to these conversations a few thoughts, I would like to expand a bit on what Roberta touched upon, which is the question of democracy. And here, because you also just briefly mentioned, James, this question of scale, I'm really interested in this question, because when I was reading your book, I was under the impression that these questions of scale are so important for your project of democratizing digital platforms. So what I want to do in the next 5 minutes or so is to say a few words about the role of democracy for platform socialism and why questions of scale are so important to the project, and also how they are actually tied into ideas of democracy. And then I would like to end with a question for you, James, on the role of protest and also collective organizing for bringing more democratic control about digital platforms. So maybe just to begin with, as a political theorist interested in digital technologies and also democracy, I was very intrigued by the idea of democracy, which informs your project of platform socialism. And what I really found very useful is the way you think about democracy, not simply as limited to a narrow political sphere of the state, but actually understanding it as a broader social life. So I think what this understanding really allows us, and your book, it does such a great job in actually showing this, is to position democracy in a radical transformation of society. So for me, platform socialism is really giving us a new way of looking at democratizing digital platforms, because it helps us to imagine an ecosystem of alternatives. And you were saying a few things about this already. So what this means is actually that your concern is not only with questions of state regulations or also workplace democracy, but with broader questions of how people can participate in the most important associations that govern their daily lives, right? So I think your book does such a good job in explaining why we need a set of new institutional arrangements on the global, on the national, but also on the local scale to take back control, basically, right? So over our critical digital infrastructures like healthcare, education, but also public transportation. And maybe for those who haven't read your book yet, so on the global scale, for example, you propose something like a digital global service organization. And then on the national scale, you emphasize the need for a new regulatory frameworks and also new ownership patterns. But for me, the most interesting point you're making is to say that platform socialism actually starts at the local level. And here you give like a range of really great examples of what digital democracy means in municipalism. But I want to challenge you on one thing. So I think for all the book's ambitions, I feel that the role of social movements and also uprisings in the struggle to democratize digital platforms needs actually more thinking. So for example, if we see the question of democratic control as fundamental to digital platforms, what role should protest and collective organizing play in bringing this about? And the reason for me why I'm asking this question is because I'm personally very skeptical that we can imagine a democratization of political institutions, but also other forms of associations of our everyday life that through democracy, and here we can think of decentralization, but also like increased participation, become actually something different. So my take here, and this is the point I want to challenge you on, is that we have to acknowledge for a project of platform socialism, we have to acknowledge the role of political struggles and uprisings, since historically we have seen that it has been like always, it have been always like social movements who actually forced us to democratize. But yeah, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on these things. And I leave it here and give it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rahel. But I don't think we disagree on anything. I think you're 100% right. The only way in which we could get a fundamental change and a democratization of society is through not just social movements building their power, but also people working through political parties and their unions. So I am very much in favor of ways in which organizations and the left more generally can build these forms of institutional power. I'm fully on board with the kind of Corbyn Sanders 2017 left, agenda of party plus movement. That has always been a kind of bedrock of what I was doing, even back when I was involved in Occupy. That was always, missing one really important strand of what would create fundamental change. And I think there's a really big continuity between the project that I did on the German council movements and this one, which is to say that building power is a fundamental prerequisite to achieving social change. I guess the point I would also agree with your critique of the book is that I think in the book I was much more focused on like talking about the cook shops of the future and what their infrastructure would be like than what the movement would be to get them there, right? Because I got a little obsessed with the organizational and institutional side of things. So I think you're right to say that maybe I have less to say about how social movements could bring that about. But I also think it's not really my role to be like the general from my home in Islington telling everyone what to do with their organizing. But I don't know, I guess you could say that there are different types of activities that different types of political theorists and activists and other people would play in this. And I thought that perhaps a small contribution would be trying to think about some of these alternative models. But I welcome that feedback. And I think that's a really good point. And thank you so much for your contribution, Rahel and Roberta. It means a lot to me. So I think having done that, I've now left hopefully not that much time for questions, because really, I think the idea, Will, if I'm not mistaken, is that people can message you. I think we posted the link on Twitter. So there was some naughty people that came in causing ruckus. So I don't think you can actually unmute yourselves without permission.
Yeah, I would say basically if you send me the questions, we've had a couple questions which weren't that productive. If you want to send some questions into the chat, you can send them to me and I can read them out basically. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm happy to answer all questions, whatever kinds of things you might have.
We've got one here. What are the structural macro level dynamic constraints on democratic governance of the platforms, if not the market for profit? So I guess maybe a way of rephrasing that would be something around what guides and provokes like a kind of, let's say, the democratic governance of platforms, if not the profit motive. What could that be?
Well, I think the alternatives that are being explored in the book are thinking about forms of commons-based and non-market forms of production. So in particular, let's think of the example of like the free and open software movement and the way in which people are kind of contributing to that. It's not necessarily about developing services in order to turn a profit. It's just about offering free digital services for people. But you're right. I think perhaps one of the problems that the question is getting at is like, how is everyone going to get paid, right? Because what I am imagining is a kind of situation in which you don't have private investment anymore, that people are given something like a basic income, that people are being able to develop for the public good and to serve common ends. So I think that, I said before that there's no platform socialism without socialism. While a lot of the specific proposals I developed focus on meso-level organizations, what would this kind of a platform look like? How would you organize that? How would users be involved? Some of the big picture questions around democratic planning and stuff, I really, you need, I rely basically on a broader system of socialism for those to be funded and to be developed and things like that. So I think that yeah, there's a kind of meso level and a much larger structural level as well.
Thanks, James. We have one more question if you've got time.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a question saying, I'm wondering about what you see as potential jurisdictional challenges, especially referring to the global nature of most platform architecture. So what happens to the majority of Facebook users, let's say, who are outside the US and EU, if these platforms get replaced by public service platforms, by platform socialism in the global north? So I guess thinking about maybe that kind of like some of the geopolitics of this, particularly given
so I
that,
think that's a really good question, and one that has come up a bit in conversations I've had around the book. In the final chapter, or one of the final chapters on the global platforms, I raised the point of digital colonialism, which is to say many of these platforms are developed in North America and are fundamentally extractive from populations in the global south. Facebook had this program called Free Basics, where it would kind of encourage people to use a very limited version of their software for free. And that kind of, focused and provided a filter for many people's access to the internet whatsoever, right? So you would get certain limited services, but your experience of the internet was just the big platforms. And there are other, very tricky strategies they have around education and schools and kids that are also basically very exploitative of populations in the global south. So I think this question of nationalization really needs to be thought of at the international level. When we had all these calls for nationalizing Amazon or nationalizing this or that organization, it's true that if that was done in America, this would fundamentally disempower all of the populations that use these services in other countries around the world. So we need to find ways to think about how these forms of democracy could operate at an international level. In the book, I talk about, starting a global digital services organization that would run alongside the ILO and other UN agencies. And through something like this, we might be able to develop forms of online democracy where people can kind of vote on what services they want developed. I talk about Decidium and a few other services that people could use to do this. But I think the question of international democracy, given that it doesn't currently exist, is a really tricky one for anyone to deal with, right? Because it's both necessary, absolutely necessary, but also a very tricky question that we don't even have forms of international democracy that work very well at that kind of level anyway. I mean, I think the elephant in the room is that many of our national democracies are not working particularly well as it is. And so this argument for a fundamental push for democratization, not only of the state, but also of other associations and other institutions, can seem quite unfeasible in our environment. But I honestly think that something like that is the only way forward. And as difficult as that is, I think this is essentially the most important thing that we could do at the moment, that we need both to further democratize the state and to push this to other domains. And that's how we can start to achieve more fundamental forms of institutional power.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and I do think one of the really unique things about the book is that it brings into conversation this, particularly the coal and the Neurath stuff, is this idea of socialism, democratizing different institutions. I mean, that should be, as you say, a goal for all democratic societies, but the platform economy in particular. That question was from Robert, and it says, thank you for responding to that.
Thanks.
We've got a few high fives and so on going on in the chat, which is nice.
That is wonderful. Loving seeing that. Maybe we can do one more question and then wrap it up, and then we can all live our lives and we can purchase the book and just enjoy life to its fullest.
Wonderful. So we have one more question in the chat, and it's basically around the contact, or perhaps just a general broader question around the free software movement, and perhaps just some of your thoughts on that, particularly some of the early internet goings on, and how does the book engage with that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, let me kind of talk about I guess the relationship between some of the visions that are happening around Web3 and the way in which the early internet communities are imagined, because I think a lot of what we see today is a call for decentralization that in reality is being driven by people who have no fundamental interest in a genuine devolution of power and a genuine distribution of resources to internet users. I think what you see in Web3 is the kind of instrumental use of a lot of people's ideas of the early internet. Because in the, as many of us will remember, in the 90s, there was this real kind of lefty tech utopianism that was in the air. People were like, yeah, we can be anyone we want to be. We're all cypherpunk supporters now. We can join online communities. Information is free. Nothing will stop us. Governments don't control the internet. We have this, free utopia. And I think the move of the big platform companies to really shut that down, to monetize it, to commercialize it in many respects, created this yearning for like a kind of imagined utopia that Web 1 or the kind of 90s internet was. I think that I have a couple of things to say here. One is that I think you can't have decentralization without democratization. And I think you can't imagine Web3 without challenging the fundamental power structures that exist in that space. And when it's the same venture capitalists who funded a lot of the big Web2 companies that are pushing for the Web3 solutions, I think that's not going to result in any kind of challenge of power, any kind of structural change that's going to happen in that space. But I also think that the real move of Web3 is to insert digital tokens into online communities and online spaces, and essentially to force everyone to buy in. And the idea is that the greater economies that exist in these online spaces, the more money all of the developers and the venture capitalists are going to make. And I think this push to further commodify the internet is a move and a step in the wrong direction. And I think that, one thing that came out really strongly, for example, in an interview between Evgeny Morozov and Francesca Bria, was that there is this kind of different tradition of Web 1. There is this kind of non-commodified and non-commercial tradition of people who were involved in things like the free and open software movement, that were designing and developing services that could be used by all, that people could share. And this push by people like Bill Gates to kind of shut that down, to commodify everything, to stop people sharing, to stop forms of cooperative production, to let things be free and accessible. I mean, this is what we have to stop, right? And this is the true alternative, right? Like platform socialism or barbarism, or platform socialism or some buying a token to get into an exclusive online nightclub where you're wearing virtual reality headset and talking to your friends that you could talk to in real life, but it costs you £50 to get in. So I think there's a certain instrumental use of some of that nostalgia. And I think it's better directed towards genuine solutions like the free and open software movement, like Mastodon, like these Fediverse alternatives. So yeah, I'm happy to leave it there. That seems like a good enough note as any to end it on.
Thanks, James. And I think on behalf of everyone who can't actually unmute themselves, I'd also like to say thank you. And thanks for the questions, and sorry we couldn't get around to all of them. There were a few others actually in there, but
sorry, guys.
I think that's it. So thank you very much, James. Everyone's got the link, everyone's got the discount code. I'm really enjoying the book, and the recording will be uploaded soon. So if anyone missed the talk, we'll put it up on our YouTube. Thank you, Rahel. Thank you, Roberta. Excellent questions, and sorry for the troubles you had at the start. Hopefully that didn't spoil your evening. Have a good evening, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming. I really appreciate it. Bye.